Before you close your eyes tonight, let me take you on a little journey. Section 1. Muddy Streets and Barking Votes. You arrive in a foggy riverside city where dogs decide politics and mud is currency. You're standing at the edge of an old stone bridge, the kind where moss overtakes mortar and the river beneath burbles like it's whispering half-remembered stories. The fog is thick tonight, curling low around your ankles and clinging to the lantern post like a lazy cat. You step forward. Your boots squelch in something that was probably mud, possibly dung, and definitely historic. Welcome to the city of Barcadia, or at least what's left of it. You can just make out the vague outlines of crumbled towers and arched gateways through the mist. Ivy droops like a half-tied ribbon over carved lintels. Somewhere in the distance, a low howl rises soft, mournful, and strangely diplomatic. Here in Barcadia, things weren't always so quiet. In fact, a few centuries back, this place was known for one rather remarkable experiment in governance. Dogs were allowed to vote. Yeah, full suffrage, furry citizens, four-legged legislators, the whole kibble. You probably wouldn't survive a day here. Not because the dogs were mean, they were mostly civil. If a little slobbery, but because the city was never designed for you. Sidewalks were chew-resistant, public fountains dispensed broth, and politics moved at the pace of a nap-prone basset hound. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, let me know your city and local time in the comments. I love hearing where this little bedtime caravan has wandered. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by padding. There's no better word for it. Down a cobbled path lined with low stone cottages and wooden signs written in curling script. Most of the signs have chew marks. Several of the doors have tiny, hinged flaps at the bottom. Occasionally, a paw print appears in the drying mud beside you, as though some long-gone citizen was just here, deciding between an afternoon nap and a political rally. Barcadia wasn't always called that. The name came later. Once the canine constitution was ratified allegedly with a group head tilt and unanimous tail wag. Before then, it was a modest riverside trade post known as Cradle's Bend, a sleepy collection of weavers, fishmongers, and cobblers whose primary excitement came from weekly goose chases and midsummer goat thefts. But one foggy spring morning, everything changed. A local philosopher named Eusebius, or possibly Goosey B, depending on which tablet you believe, made a strange proclamation after slipping on a wet stone and being licked awake by a large spotted mutt. The dog, according to Eusebius's later writings, possessed the gaze of a statesman and the breath of divine clarity. Historians still argue whether Eusebius actually believed the dog spoke to him or if he was simply concussed. But what followed was undeniable. A movement began. First, a handful of elders allowed their dogs to accompany them into council chambers. Then the dogs began barking at particularly disagreeable decisions. Eventually, a vote was held. Only one man voted against the proposal, and his cat reportedly shredded the ballots in protest. Now, this wasn't democracy in the modern sense. Votes were cast by paw press on treated clay tiles baked afterward to seal the choice. Dogs were paired with human interpreters, or paw mates, who helped translate tail wag intensities and sniff frequencies into actionable policies. The accuracy of these interpretations, highly debatable. But the people, perhaps tired of making their own decisions, embraced it. After all, it was hard to accuse a Labrador of corruption. You pass a circular plaza with a central statue, what's left of it. Anyway, a stubby bronze tail remains, wagging eternally. The inscription at the base reads, in cracked old Barcadian, to the loyal elector, Cleo, who voted only when necessary. Cleo, as you'll hear more about soon, was the first officially registered voter, a Saint Bernard of intimidating girth and legendary flatulence. Cleo once famously fell asleep during a tax debate, which halted proceedings for 3 days out of respect. City life adjusted around the new system. Leashes became ceremonial garb. Voting days were national holidays, everyone brought treats. And although it may sound absurd now, citizens claim to feel more listened to. It turns out, when your elected official sleeps beside your hearth and licks your face on Tuesdays, accountability hits differently. Of course, not every dog had the temperament for politics. Spaniels tended to vote emotionally, terriers aggressively, and greyhounds rarely showed up. Debates sometimes devolved into barking matches, but actual violence was rare unless someone brought a squirrel into chambers. In the early years, records show remarkably little upheaval. The laws passed were simple, sniff-tested, and largely centered on food safety and nap zoning. There was an entire codex devoted to blanket share law, which outlined who got which corner of communal rugs based on temperature, breed, and prior snuggling rights. You pause at an arched gate once guarded by the Watchdogs Guild, a voluntary association of retired political pups who took up civic protection duties. Their motto, still faintly visible in scratched sandstone, translates roughly to sniff twice, bark once. That's not to say humans were entirely powerless. People still cooked the meals, filled out the forms, and scheduled the walk meetings. But authority came from the pack. Laws were debated by growl length and enforced with gentle nuzzles or, in rare cases, withheld ear scratches. At its peak, Barcadia had a population of nearly 8,000 dogs and just under 5,000 humans. Visitors wrote of its odd tranquility. A Syrian trader once noted, here, the dogs are kings, but they do not bite unless you disrespect their water bowls. So tonight, as you stroll these muddy paths and imagine the wagging council in session, let yourself laugh softly at the absurdity of it all. Or better yet, drift toward sleep the way Barcadian citizens once drifted through life, slow, gentle, a little fuzzy, and entirely convinced their leaders had the best nose for the job. Section 2. The Council of Collars meet the ruling assembly part statesman, part kennel club, and the logic behind their paws-on policies. You're not entirely sure how you got invited, but tonight you're attending a session of the Council of Collars. It's held in what remains of the Grand Pantheon, once an elegant domed structure with wooden rafters and a mosaic floor covered in paw prints. The roof is mostly gone now, but you can imagine the space lit by oil lamps and filled with the comforting smell of damp fur and crushed biscuits. There's a hush in the air, broken only by the gentle flop of a soft ear and the rhythmic click of claws on stone. The council chamber is a perfect circle, not for symbolic reasons, mind you, just easier for the dogs to see each other and bark in polite succession. In the middle is the treat stone, a raised dais where motions were proposed. Anyone who reached it without drooling or veering off course was granted the floor. Or, more accurately, the mat. Each council member wore an official collar of office embroidered with their district's emblem and sometimes tastefully scented with lavender to discourage fleas. You had representatives from the river paws, the eastern tailors, the mid-burrow muzzles, and even the forest strays. Occasionally, a guest delegate from neighboring regions would attend like the dignified emissary from the Badger Consortium, though they rarely stayed for the full session. A typical meeting started with a roll call sniff. One by one, dogs would walk the circle, sniffing each other's hindquarters to confirm identity. This wasn't just protocol, it was documentation. Barcadia had no written birth certificates, only scent trails. If you changed shampoo, it could delay legislation for days. Once sniffed in, the agenda would be laid out. It was usually barked once in formal tone, then again in gentle woof for the elders. Today's topics might include alleyway squirrel incursions, distribution of community belly rubs, and the troubling decline in marrow bone donations. The Council of Collars didn't function on votes alone. Debate was structured around what they called the 3 whimpers. The first whimper indicated concern. The second, disapproval. The third, outrage, though usually followed by someone falling asleep. If a measure passed all 3 whimpers and was met with a unified tail wag, it was considered law. If not, it was tabled until the next full moon or until someone remembered where they buried it. Now, the interpreters, or pawmates, were crucial. Each dog had won a human bonded in mutual respect, often with matching scarves. These humans took notes, relayed barks into human speak, and occasionally distracted overly excited members with liver treats. Their job wasn't to lead, only to listen and echo. Historians still argue whether the dogs genuinely dictated policy or if the humans subtly influenced proceedings. Some say the humans used hand gestures, subtle cues, or hidden cheese to sway opinions. Others argue that, given the average human's love of bureaucracy, no one could have made this stuff up on their own. Still, the records survive, engraved onto biscuit-shaped stone tablets, now held in cracked clay jars. They speak of complex political maneuverings, the Paw Fence Treaty, which defined backyard boundaries after a dispute involving a stolen slipper, the Great Tail Wag Compromise, allowing short-tailed breeds equal sniffing rights, and the legendary sit-stay filibuster of year 217, where a stubborn mastiff refused to move for 6 days, effectively blocking a law to ban mailman impersonators. It wasn't always orderly. You had factions, the bark liberals, who believed in free leash zones and universal tennis balls, and the snout traditionalists, who supported strong fences and strict no-petting-after-dinner policies. Their debates, while mostly cordial, could get heated. Once, during a particularly tense budget discussion, someone accidentally squeaked a toy. The entire chamber erupted into chaos, but these weren't just political charades. Barcadia's council addressed real concerns, outbreaks of kennel cough, ethical standards for tail chasing in public, and whether barking at thunder was a protected form of protest. Visitors who witnessed sessions described them as strangely moving. "There is no dishonesty in a tail wag," wrote one Carthaginian merchant. "Their laws are simple, their justice unchewed." At times, foreign dignitaries were invited to witness or even present requests to the council. There's record of a delegation from a nearby feline territory, likely the whiskered reclaimers petitioning for shared sunlit window sills. The meeting ended in mutual licking and one unfortunate hairball incident. Still, some temporary peace was brokered. Council members often retired after 5 years of service, receiving honorary titles such as Grand Fetcher or Keeper of the Leash. Their collars were preserved in velvet-lined chests and passed down ceremonially, though many simply used them as pillows. The Grand Pantheon itself was a feat of hybrid architecture, designed jointly by barkitects and humans. It featured acoustics that amplified even the softest whimper. Murals adorned the walls, showing scenes of historic votes, the first fire hydrant ordinance, the anti-vacuum treaty, and the moment a group of beagles peacefully protested the trimming of ear fur, even in ruins. You can sense the reverence. Ivy creeps through the cracked tile, brushing over ancient chew marks. A sunbeam filters in through what was once a skylight, illuminating a faded paw print pressed into stone. You crouch beside it. It's smaller than your palm, worn but unmistakable. Maybe Cleo stood here. Maybe she barked once, with quiet authority, and changed the city's path forever. There's a strange comfort in it all, knowing that somewhere, sometime, a city tried something so utterly absurd and made it work for a while, that a council chamber could echo not with yelling, but with soft yawns and sleepy consensus. That sometimes a wagging tail might be more honest than a raised hand. You take one more look around. The council has adjourned for now, but the silence here feels less like abandonment and more like a nap in progress. Section 3. How the Dogs Got the Vote. A tale involving ancient loyalty oaths, an eccentric philosopher, and one very good boy named Cleo. You're walking down a narrow lane now, worn smooth by paws rather than hooves, toward a quiet neighborhood where everything began. The ground is uneven, a patchwork of flattened grass and rounded cobbles, with tufts of something suspiciously biscuit-colored poking out between the cracks. Here, where the river bends and the reeds whisper your arrival, stands a low wooden house with a thatched roof and a faded door painted with the unmistakable print of a dog's paw. This is the home, they say, where Cleo was born. Cleo, the name carries weight, not unlike the dog herself. Described in early records as a Saint Bernard, with the patience of a philosopher and the appetite of a small army. Cleo was more than a pet. She was a turning point. Her owner, the philosopher Eusebius, or Goosey B, as he was cheekily known in town, lived here too. A man fond of long walks, half-finished scrolls, and questions no one wanted to answer. It was Eusebius who first dared to suggest, quite seriously, that dogs might be capable of political participation. Now, we're not talking about a modern political manifesto. His original idea, scratched onto a fish wrapper in a moment of enthusiasm, was more of a thought experiment. If dogs can be trained to fetch slippers, might they not also fetch justice? Historians still argue whether this was satirical, sincere, or the result of mild mold poisoning. But what's undeniable is that Eusebius spent the next 3 years developing what would later be called the Canine Civic Codex. The Codex was a curious document, part philosophy, part observation, part poetic ramble. In it, Eusebius outlined a theory that dogs possessed a natural sense of fairness, loyalty, and, in his words, an incorruptible heart, unspoiled by human vanity. He cited Cleo's behavior as evidence her tendency to share food with smaller dogs, her refusal to bark during thunderstorms, and her uncanny ability to choose the correct path home, even when he'd clearly gotten lost. You pass a small stone marker by the garden gate. It's carved with an image of Cleo asleep under a tree, flanked by 2 bowls, one labeled truth, the other duty. Locals say that whenever Cleo was presented with multiple treats, she'd always pick the one closest to the more deserving dog. Whether that's true or just fond memory, who's to say? The turning point came during a town meeting, one of those interminable affairs where fish taxes were debated with a level of passion usually reserved for territorial seagulls. Cleo, bored and slightly damp, wandered in and flopped herself down beside the treat stone. Someone offered her a biscuit. She declined. Instead, she lifted one paw and placed it gently on the side of the stone. It was a simple gesture, but somehow It paused the argument. Everyone stopped talking. Even the man shouting about eel licensing fell quiet. And then, something even stranger happened. The group, unprompted, agreed to the measure under discussion, the establishment of a public fish market with rotating vendor rights. No shouting, no debates, just one big, collective nod. It was as though the paw had broken a spell. Or maybe they just wanted to reward the only creature in the room who hadn't spoken over anyone. From that moment, Cleo became a fixture. Her votes were symbolic. At first, a light-hearted tradition, a novelty. But as the weeks went on, and more people brought their dogs to meetings, the novelty hardened into practice. Paw prints were pressed into clay tiles and archived. Rules were established. The paw press became a legitimate, if unusual, form of civic expression. You pass a building labeled Archives of the Snout. Inside, dusty ledgers record these early votes. Each entry lists a motion, a dog's name, the interpreter's initials, and, charmingly, the type of treat given afterward. For Cleo's first official vote motion to install communal shade tents in the central plaza, treat smoked herring biscuit. Other entries include Rufus the Elder approved weekly cheese rations, treat goat milk cube. Lady Tippy opposed bell collars for puppies, treat none dietary restrictions. Spindle abstained on leash tax reform. Treat whole chicken leg, later removed on appeal. But it wasn't just a circus of snacks and paw prints. The city began to organize itself around the system. Voting tiles were standardized. A scent verification protocol was created to avoid paw fraud. Dogs with a track record of disruptive behavior looking at you. Bartholomew the Unleashed were gently guided toward advisory roles. Even Cleo had her controversies. Some claimed her votes were influenced by her fondness for Eusebius's sandals. Others whispered that she barked twice during a vote on composting laws, which broke protocol. But overall, her record was respected. When she passed away peacefully, on a rug embroidered with the city's seal, her collar was retired and placed in the treat stone itself. To this day, fragments of that collar remain: brass, leather, and something that might have once been cheese. Local pups sometimes sniff the stone with a curious reverence, as if sensing some ancient wisdom baked into the cracks. You sit for a moment in what was once Cleo's garden. The breeze smells faintly of thyme and rain-wet wood. A single daisy has grown up through the old vote-pressing platform, stretching toward the waning light. It's easy to laugh at it all from a distance. A city that let dogs vote, that built policy around tail wags and nap preferences. But as you sit here, wrapped in the hush of twilight, and the ghost of something soft and warm leaning against your leg, you start to wonder, maybe they were onto something. Maybe a society that prioritized loyalty over rhetoric, stillness over speed, and community naps over political grandstanding wasn't so silly after all. Section 4. Humans still had jobs. Sort of learn what roles remained for people in this upside-down civic system, mostly snack-based. Your feet carry you through the quieter edges of the city now, where the paw-pressed tiles give way to weedy alleys and quiet yards, still marked with chew-dented fence posts. You're walking the working districts where humans, once a proud pillar of Barcadia's civic machine, took on different roles. Because while dogs cast the votes and napped in council chambers, someone still had to run the bakery. Humans weren't banned from politics. Exactly. They were simply unburdened by it, freed from the exhausting business of arguing over curb widths and soup ladle standards. People took to tasks more suited to their thumbs: cooking, stitching, sweeping, and, of course, belly rubbing. These were not the duties of the disenfranchised. They were proud positions in a system that prized ear scritches over economic theory. Still, if you're imagining some kind of tail-wagging utopia where humans and dogs co-governed in harmony, well, that's partly true. But like all things, it depended on the day, the mood, and whether or not someone had dropped a sausage in the council vestibule. You pass a tanner's shop, its sign still barely hanging, picturing a grinning pug in a cape. This was once the headquarters of the Order of the Leathers, a guild of humans tasked with maintaining ceremonial collars, cloaklets, and the increasingly elaborate leash sashes worn by political pups. Every representative had a signature look. Some collars jingled with bells to show transparency. Others included stitched family crests, scented with clove or dried mint, to prevent nose distraction during meetings. Guild records, now just faded scrolls in a damp crate, show that disputes sometimes erupted not over policy but fashion. In one case, a delegate from the River Paws walked out in protest after another dog arrived in a matching tartan. Scandalous. Back in the bakery district, you can still smell the echoes of toasted barley and bone broth. The humans here were known as the crumbrights. Their job to design and deliver ballots. Yes, the ballots were edible. Clay pressings were the official vote. Yes. But each major motion also came with a symbolic treat, a biscuit baked in the shape of the issue itself. A vote for extended leash hours might come as a long, narrow chew, a tax break on imported fish, a crunchy sardine-shaped wafer. The dogs, of course, didn't eat the ballots until after the vote. Usually, historians still argue whether the humans in this system were subservient, symbolic, or simply in on the joke. Some contemporary writings suggest they relished the role. Others hinted occasional resentment, especially around election season, when baking quotas tripled and some dogs grew finicky. One anonymous parchment reads, "Made 12 dozen turkey chive biscuits. Council rejected them for lack of inner spirit. Attempted again with rosemary. Approved instantly. I weep." Even within their constraints, humans found ways to innovate. Some became political consultants, interpreting bark tone and tail speed into issue tracking. Others took up trade, opening policy snack carts that roamed neighborhoods selling pre-vote treats, unofficial polls, and council gossip disguised as chew toy sales pitches. And yet, in the margins, you feel the flicker of a different story. In the apothecary's cracked doorway, you spot graffiti scrawled in faint ink, "Who leads the leash?" and "Who holds it?" There were murmurs, whispers in the taverns where the ale was watered down and the sausages were real. Some humans, especially those outside the central wards, wondered if their dogs were truly voting or if the interpreters, the pawmates, were gently guiding their choices. After all, who decides when a bark means I and when it's just a flea? The interpreter role, you realize, was delicate. Each pawmate was bound by oath to translate faithfully. These oaths were made public, witnessed by both citizens and canines, and sealed with an exchange of scent, a sniff to the forehead, a tail circle, and a mutual nap within 10 feet of each other. Violation of this bond could result in banishment from council spaces and the loss of ear privileges for life. A stiff penalty. Still, as power concentrated in paws, humans quietly carved out their own domains. Theaters rose where puppetry became satire, featuring elaborate felt canines reenacting recent council decisions. One popular show, Bark Me No Lies, involved a mutt-shaped marionette refusing to fetch until policy changed on alley access. It ran for 6 seasons, Some humans specialized in dog massage and aromatherapy, becoming trusted wellness advisors to overstimulated Labradors. Others wrote the scent scrolls, public notices infused with pheromones to deliver official updates in olfactory form. You pass a hollowed-out kiosk now, labeled Snoot News. Trust the nose. The shelves are long empty, but you imagine them once filled with scrolls bundled in ribbons, each carrying not ink, but scent lavender for peace, sage for reform, and sardine for public scandal. Power in Barcadia, it turns out, was not a zero-sum game. It was diffuse, shared, wagged around. The dogs held the vote, but humans held the snacks, the stories, the symbols, and in any society, that's where the soul tends to live. By the time you find yourself back at the edge of the council quarter, your feet are coated in dust and a few crumbs, your nose tinged with old rosemary and fur. You hear the distant creak of wind through hollow chimes, the ones that used to hang outside lawkeeper homes, and somewhere in that sound, soft, silly, noble, sleepy, you hear the quiet compromise of a world that didn't need to make sense to work. Section 5, Dogs, Taxes, and the Biscuit Economy. Explore the city's complex food-based trade system, where obedient schools double as banks. Your path winds now through the heart of what was once Barcadia's bustling commercial district if, of course, you measure bustling in tail wags per minute. This was the Biscuit Bazaar, the city's grand central market. Not so much a bazaar in the shouting, bartering, elbow-jabbing sense. More like an open-air nap site with occasional economic transactions. But here is where it all happened: trade, taxation, negotiations, and the rise of the infamous biscuit-based economy. At first glance, it sounds ridiculous. An entire monetary system built on dog treats. And yet, it functioned with surprising sophistication. Treats weren't just food here. They were units of value, social currency, and political persuasion. Think of them as chewy coins, edible. Yes, but carefully measured, baked to standard, and often stamped with the city seal, a proud dog's face licking its own nose. There were entire classes of biscuit denominations. The basic bicket, a small barley and beef crisp, was used for day-to-day transactions. A Crunchin was worth 5 bickets and came in rosemary chicken flavor. Then there was the Golden Chomp, a ceremonial biscuit the size of your palm, flavored with rare cheeses and saffron, only awarded by the council, never sold. You pause at the remains of a vendor's stall stone counter, scattered shards of glaze where once a warming bowl sat. The stall sign still hangs askew, burned slightly around the edges. It reads Mildred's Minty Marrow Melts, tax deductible. Because, yes, Barcadia had taxes, sort of. Taxes were not paid in coin or livestock, but in treats. Households were required to produce a monthly quota of biscuits based on property size and tail density. Tail density being a rough proxy for pet ownership. In wealthier districts, humans outsourced biscuit production to specialized bakeries. In poorer wards, families held bake days, communal events complete with folk songs, paw-stamping dances, and judging contests for most economically efficient crunch. The biscuits were collected in woven satchels and delivered to the Hall of Fair Distribution, where a group of elder beagles known as the Sniff Review Board would inspect, count, and occasionally taste test samples for authenticity. Historians still argue whether this biscuit tax system was sustainable. Some claim it led to flour shortages and rising yeast inflation. Others believe it strengthened community ties and resulted in the tastiest bureaucracy in recorded history. Of course, like any currency, the biscuit had its dark side. Counterfeiters emerged. Some unscrupulous bakers began adding sawdust, or worse, using catnip as filler. The treat purity laws of year 143 banned artificial flavorings and required at least 60% meat content in all high-tier biscuits. Violators were sentenced to mandatory walkathons and public tail-shaming. There was also the issue of spoilage. Currency that could rot wasn't ideal, especially during humid summers. Enter the Vault of Cold Bones, located beneath a central plaza. This refrigerated chamber, cool thanks to a combination of subterranean springs and a rotating team of snoozing huskies, stored the city's biscuit reserves. It was the Barcadian treasury, complete with bone-etched ledgers, paw-print security seals, and a strict no-snacking policy. You walk past what's left of its entrance, now a half-submerged stairwell guarded by two crumbling statues, one of Cleo holding a biscuit in her mouth, and the other of a nameless puppy drooling on a ledger. Prices were not static in Barcadia. Inflation was measured in the tailwag index, a literal count of tailwags per biscuit offered during public transactions. If you offered a crunchin and received only a half wag in return, it meant the market was flooded. A triple tail thump economic boom. Merchants had to be savvy. Some began offering services: fur grooming, flea removal, bedtime lullabies instead of goods, to offset treat fluctuations. There were whispers of a treatless utopia, an experimental commune in the hills where dogs and humans bartered in cuddles and compost, but it didn't last. Too many hugs, not enough protein. Meanwhile, biscuits gained symbolic value. Council sessions were often concluded by breaking and sharing a ceremonial treat among all attendees, a gesture of unity and good digestion. Treats were offered at weddings, treaties, and funerals where they were not eaten, but buried, usually near a favorite tree. And let us not forget the role of obedience schools. Part training ground, part banking system. These institutions offered obedience bonds, biscuits stored in a secure vault, redeemable after performance of certain tasks or services. Students who passed courses in advanced sit or public speaking without excessive panting received treat stipends and sometimes even scholarships to further training. Some of the larger schools issued what were essentially loans. A dog could receive a lump sum biscuit advance to be repaid through community service fetching parcels, accompanying the elderly, or serving as emotional support during long speeches on urban leash reform. One black Labrador named Gubbins became famous for defaulting on a biscuit loan, citing emotional distress related to squeaky toy shortage. He was later pardoned after a public apology and a heartfelt nuzzle with the treat master general. But despite the occasional scandal, the biscuit economy mostly worked. It relied on trust, craftsmanship, and a deep cultural agreement that a good treat, like a good nap, was sacred. You pass what might have been a bank, once 4 stone pillars, toppled now and half buried in vines. A brass plaque still clings to the front. It reads, "In bone we trust, in biscuit we govern." And just beyond, a child's toy, weathered but recognizable. A plush pig with a single word stitched into its side. Deposit. The air is sweet here. Faint notes of wheat and rosemary still linger in the stones. You sit on one, just for a moment, and feel the gentle rhythm of an economy that was never about profit, but about presence, about giving something meaningful and getting a wag in return. In Barcadia, that was always enough. Section 6. When it rained. It really rained wade through the infrastructure mess of a city that built its gutters for canines, not carts. By the time your feet take you toward the older roads now buckled under creeping vines and shaggy clover, you begin to notice a strange design flaw. The gutters are everywhere, deep, winding, perfectly curved, and entirely too low to be for carts or wagons. No, these weren't meant for wheel runoff. These were purpose-built for paws. When it rained in Barcadia, it really rained. And the city's drainage system, like most of its urban planning, catered not to human convenience, but canine comfort. Streets sloped at odd angles not just for runoff, but to divert water away from popular napping spots. Umbrellas were rare, but communal awnings embroidered with noble dog houses' emblems could be unfurled during downpours to shield a seated retriever or two. You stroll alongside what was once Tail Drip Avenue, one of the city's main trade routes, and marvel at the intricacy of its water flow design. Gutter width was standardized to one nose and a paw, a unit that never quite made it into broader imperial measurement systems. The city even employed splash counters appointed dogs who patrolled intersections during storms to track the effectiveness of puddle dispersal with wag meters. Historians still argue whether these drainage methods were copied from an earlier culture or entirely original. Some say they were inspired by the terraced irrigation systems of highland farmers. Others claim it was simply the outcome of many wet paws and a stubborn shepherd named Wexley who refused to step in the same puddle twice. You stop beside an old tower now leaning slightly, more vine than brick. This was the Department of Damp Affairs, the civic body tasked with managing all things weather-related. It was half meteorological institute, half towel distribution center. Inside, dozens of civic towels were stored, labeled by district, breed, and fur length. Humans employed here were known as the fluffers, a noble title, if ever one existed. Their primary task, ensuring every soggy politician was gently dried before entering any chamber of debate. It was considered a breach of decorum to shake dry in a public forum. Accidental splatterings were met with scandal, hushed murmurs, and in one case, an official reprimand in the form of a strongly worded bark. But the city's rain problem wasn't just about damp paws and inconvenient drizzles. Barcadia's location along a lazy, slow-moving river meant that storms often led to flooding. In the early years, entire neighborhoods, particularly the low-lying Soggy Tails district, would vanish under murky water for days at a time. Canoes were deployed. Dogs were floated around in woven baskets. One account describes a particularly determined corgi navigating a tax proposal aboard a hollowed-out pumpkin. Eventually, engineering caught up. Elevated walkways were built, affectionately called scoot paths. These narrow bridges allowed for high water travel during the worst of the rainy season. Council members would be pulled along them in wheeled carts or carried by specially trained humans wearing water-repellent tunics and booties that jingled just enough to alert passing pups. You pass one of those elevated paths now. The wood has softened with time, but you can still see the chewed corners suggesting some dogs preferred to gnaw their way to higher ground. To accommodate flood seasons, Barcadia also developed a curious architectural style. Instead of building upward or outward, many homes featured underground dry dens, snug, rounded rooms padded with hay, designed to hold families, important scrolls, and, most importantly, biscuit reserves. Some had bone storage closets. Others included full snoring chambers, where acoustics were fine-tuned to enhance the comforting rhythm of a communal nap. One pamphlet from the time boasts dry den are 4 flood-proof, flea-proof, and approved by 3 out of 4 bulldogs. Civic pride in these structures ran deep. Entire festivals were held when a neighborhood completed a new den cluster. You can almost imagine the parade's wet dogs in flower crowns. flutes made of hollow marrow bones, banners that sagged under the weight of celebratory sausages. Still, despite all their precautions, the rain remained a perennial nuisance. Not dangerous, necessarily, just persistent. And Barcadia's solution wasn't to fight it, but to plan around it. They embraced the drizzle. There were even laws about post-rain walk conduct. Dogs were encouraged to pause at communal towel posts, where humans waited patiently to dab paws and fluff damp ears. Refusal to be dried was technically a civic offense, but only enforced if you dripped into sacred spaces like the council mat or the grand biscuit vault. Of course, not every dog cooperated. The wetter breed spaniels, Newfoundlands, the famously soggy Berkshire Terriers often resisted towel time. One particularly dramatic case involved a soggy delegate refusing to be dried after walking through 6 consecutive puddles. When asked why, his interpreter claimed the dog was in mourning for the forgotten gutter dogs. A public drying was arranged, complete with poetic readings and a 3-chew salute. Even the weather had rituals. You reach the end of the avenue now, where a crumbling wall bears a mural in fading tile. It shows a massive rain cloud hovering over a slumbering city. The words beneath barely legible. Let the skies fall, we shall nap beneath them. And that, perhaps, is the truest spirit of Barcadia. Not avoidance, not resistance, just a sort of stubborn, tail-thumping acceptance. Rain or shine, puddle or drought, they carried on ears damp, biscuits dry, democracy intact. You tilt your face to the wind. A few drops fall, fat and slow, trailing down your cheek like a memory. The gutters around you whisper to life, and the road hums with a soft trickle of things designed not for conquest or grandeur, but for the comfort of paws that padded here long before you. Section 7. Pooch Fashion and the Collar Wars. From velvet collars to the great flea repellent scandal, politics got personal in the marketplace. You're back in the heart of the market district, where noise once danced between stone walls like wind through a kennel of excited pups. Though silence rules now, you can almost hear the distant jingle of tags and soft gossip exchanged over well-scented collars. Welcome to the Barcadian Fashion Quarter. It wasn't always glamorous, at least. Not by human standards. But here, amidst tailors' shops and flea-deterrent perfumeries, the politics of appearance were taken very seriously, especially when it came to collars. Collars weren't just accessories. They were statements, identification, status symbols. Entire political careers were launched or ended based on the width of a collar band or the amount of tasteful drool it could sustain. The rise and fall of certain styles even mirrored Barcadia's shifting ideologies: minimalist linen for the egalitarians, velvet-trimmed double collars for the aristopups, and yes, fringed collars for the rebellious bohemian beagles of the West Ward. You pause in front of an old storefront with its signage still intact. The Velvet Snout, fine collarware since year 88. Its windows, cracked and dusty, display mannequin dogs wearing ornate, if slightly chewed, accessories. One is encrusted with little bells. Another features a pocket clearly designed to carry small treats, a miniature scroll, or a single flower offered during courtship. Historians still argue whether the pocket collar was a functional innovation or merely a flirtation gimmick. Either way, it scandalized the council for a brief period before being embraced in the festival of public sniffs. But this wasn't all just fluff. In Barcadia, the political collar was regulated by strict civic code. Materials had to be ethically sourced, no squirrel hide, ever. Length and weight limits were enforced to prevent overbearing fashion statements that might unfairly distract from actual governance. During one hot summer, a law was passed banning all metal-adorned collars due to jingle fatigue among council staff. The most infamous of these scandals was, of course, the great flea repellent controversy. It started innocently enough. A high-ranking delegate from the Northern Paws arrived to a budget hearing wearing a new scented collar, one infused with peppermint and rosemary oil. The room, reportedly, smelled divine. However, as the hours wore on, dogs seated nearby began to scratch. One rolled on his back and refused to vote. Rumors spread that the collar's scent was a veiled attempt at manipulation, a form of aromatic voter suppression. Protests broke out. Slogans were barked. "Let the scent be free," and "down with nose-nudging" were scrawled on fence posts. A tribunal was held. The accused collar was placed in a sealed sniff box, and impartial beagles were brought in to assess the intent of its aroma. The verdict excessively persuasive, but not malicious. Still, new legislation followed. All future collar scents had to be declared publicly and approved by the Neutral Snout Board, a team of scent sommeliers trained to detect unfair influence. One notable member, a whippet named Sloop, became famous for vetoing over 30 perfumes in a single week, declaring them emotionally intrusive. You duck into a small alley now, where the faded outlines of temporary market stalls can still be seen, etched into the stone. This was where the semi-annual collar wars took place, a surprisingly civil affair. The collar wars were fashion exhibitions sponsored by political groups, where dogs modeled the latest in democratic attire. Points were awarded for bark impact, tail compatibility, and biscuit concealment. The audience Barcadia's citizens, who voted not with paws but with howls. The loudest howls, of course, determined the winners. A long, mournful howl denoted aesthetic despair. A short, joyful yip indicated delight. A full-throated, sustained ah-woo meant applause and possibly an endorsement. Some dogs trained specifically for these events, practicing tail sweeps and head tilts for weeks in anticipation. One dachshund named Pretzel famously caused a sensation by debuting a reversible collar velvet on one side. Hemp on the other flipped mid-strut. The crowd howled so long the event ran late and snacks had to be redistributed by emergency ration. Of course, not everyone approved of Barcadia's fashion obsession. The minimalist pups of the bear collar movement rejected all accessories, claiming true leadership came from within the chest fluff. They marched, collarless and proud, often in rain, sometimes in mud, and never without philosophical pamphlets chewed at the corners. You spot one of those pamphlets now, half buried near an old bench. It's titled down with decorative distractions, a manifesto in drool. Still, even critics of the fashion culture admitted that collars served a vital role. They marked rank, helped identify political factions, and, crucially, provided a platform for custom tags. These tags were sometimes humorous bark twice for yes, sometimes aspirational sniff, nap lead, and often coded with tiny etched symbols that functioned like bark QR codes if you knew how to read them. It's easy to dismiss it all as silly, decorative fluff, wag-fueled vanity. But when you walk these streets, you feel the weight of it the ways identity and leadership wove together in soft leathers, stitched embroidery, and scent. Collars weren't about domination. They were about recognition, about pride. You end your walk at the old collar registry, a domed building with walls covered in thousands of engraved names and collar sketches. Delegates, pawmates, fashion rebels. Their legacy hangs here, echoing like the soft click of a tag against an empty bowl. One name stands out, traced in silverleaf Clio, One collar wore it well. You smile, because in Barcadia, they understood something we often forget. Sometimes, dignity starts with a simple band around the neck and someone who believes you deserve to wear it. Section 8. Civic festivals and bark-offs follow the sleepy rhythm of annual dog-led parades, dance rituals, and diplomatic howling. The street curves now into a broad, open space wider than the council square, and clearly built for noise. The stone underfoot shifts to something smoother, swept clean by generations of paws, and the remnants of colorful streamers still hang limply from a rusted iron arch. You've arrived at Barcadia's festival grounds. If there was one thing Barcadians took as seriously as governance, it was celebration. And no celebration surpassed the bark-offs. These weren't competitions in the strictest sense. No judges, no prizes, just ceremonial howling under the moon, often accompanied by tail-thumping drum beats, choreographed trotting, and the occasional mid-performance nap. Bark-offs were both spectacle and diplomacy, part parade, part summit. Delegates and citizens came together not to argue but to sing, sniff, and declare their love of the city in chorus. You walk the edges of the field now, where stalls once served turkey leg biscuits and mulled marrow cider. Lanterns would have hung low here, casting warm yellow halos that flickered on eager snouts and laughing faces. The stage itself, just a raised wooden platform with chew marks along one side, still stands in pieces. One broken plank reads, "Reserved for Cleo," because, of course, she barked first. The story goes like this after her 5th year of voting. Cleo was celebrated at the inaugural bark-off. She stood on the stage, looked over the crowd, and let out a single, slow, dignified roof. The audience went still. Then they erupted. Every dog joined in. For 15 minutes straight, the valley echoed with approval, pride, and a sense of pack unity that no written constitution could ever quite match. It became tradition. Not every dog got to bark on stage, only those elected or deeply respected. And, unlike in politics, the goal wasn't volume, it was tone, emotion, harmony. Some practiced for weeks, others, like a famously soulful basset hound named Clovis, just howled from the heart and moved the entire plaza to tears. One visitor from a distant province wrote, "It was like hearing the wind sing through every tree you've ever loved." But the bark-off was only one part of the festival cycle. Throughout the year, Barcadia held a rotating calendar of civic celebrations. The festival of First Sniff Spring, honoring new citizens with a ceremonial group sniffing and name bestowal howl. Treatmas Midsummer, where homes exchanged decorated biscuits and children buried surprise snacks for others to find. The Great Zoomy Run Autumn, a full-day citywide dash that doubled as urban patrol and pest deterrent. Night of the Tail Lanterns Winter, when pups and humans alike released floating paper tails into the river to remember lost companions. Each of these events was as much about cohesion as tradition. They weren't holidays in the sense of rest. They were active, joyous affirmations of shared identity rooted in fur, laughter, and the knowledge that naps were better taken with others nearby. You pause beside a faded festival map painted directly onto the cobblestones. It's simple, a few paw prints leading to different areas: Howl Circle, Sniff Grove, Tail Tent, Nap Nook, each labeled with stylized drawings and now, sadly, stained by time and moss. The Tail Tent was infamous, actually. A massive pavilion filled with ribbons, beads, and tail accessories. Entire families came to decorate their dogs' tails with loops, jingles, and even soft glowing stones tied on with yarn. Judges, usually senior pawmates, walked through offering compliments, tea, and the occasional fashion citation for excessive sparkle. But perhaps the most cherished moment of the festival came during the dusk ceremony known as the collective wag. At twilight, the music would stop, the crowd would fall silent, and then, one by one, dogs would begin to wag their tails in unison slowly, like a metronome for contentment. The rhythm built, a rustling like dry leaves in the wind, until the sound filled the field with this gentle, calming percussion. It was hypnotic, sleepy, sacred. Humans participated too by humming softly or drumming their fingers against their palms. Together, it made a lullaby of movement, a song you couldn't hum but could feel in your ribs. Historians still argue whether this ritual had spiritual origins or was just a coincidental result of overfeeding during the festival. Either way, those who witnessed it never forgot it. There were always new additions. Of course, at one point, there was an interpretive rolling contest. Another year introduced a competitive nap zone, where dogs tried to fall asleep in the most creative position possible. A three-legged curl with chin on paw won gold. And once, the council briefly introduced a storytelling stage where pawmates recited bedtime tales from the city's founding, half-fact, half-fantasy, entirely charming. One such story involved a dog who chased a thundercloud until it ran out of rain. Another featured a pack that barked the moon into rising when it seemed too shy to show itself. Truth didn't matter. It was the telling that counted. The final night of the bark-off always ended the same way, with a howl benediction, led by whichever pup had served longest on the council. They'd climb to the stage, look to the stars, and howl not at the moon, but toward each other, eyes closed, tails still, then silence, then sleep. You linger on the field, your footsteps soft against the flattened grass. You can almost see them fur-tousled, collars askew, biscuits half-eaten in the dust, and contentment spread thick as butter over the whole of the city. You sit, and for a moment, just one quiet moment, you let yourself imagine the night air filled again with that harmonious, goofy, glorious sound. A city barking not in anger, but in celebration. Section 9. Not everyone was wagging. Meet the cat-aligned dissidents and rebellious rodents plotting reform from beneath floorboards. You follow a narrow trail leading out of the festival grounds, its cobbles thinner, more spaced, and clearly less traveled. The path dips beneath an old stone arch half swallowed by ivy. Faint claw marks still etch the threshold, but they're smaller, lighter, cautious, feline. Not every tail in Barcadia wagged in approval. Behind the music, the collars, the joyous, wag-fueled democracy, a quieter opposition rustled, and many of them had whiskers. You've entered what was once known, rather ominously, as the Shadow Burrow, a collection of alleys and lofts above bakeries, beneath barns, and inside crawl spaces where paws rarely padded. This was the domain of the whiskered descent, a loose collective of cats, mice, birds, and a few humans who preferred the old systems, or simply didn't like biscuits. Here, things moved at a slower rhythm. Where Barcadia ran on public festivals and open debate, the Shadow Burrow moved in silence and glances, and purring, a lot of purring, with undertones of judgment. At first, the cats had been indifferent. When the Council of Collars formed, they mostly yawned and returned to sun patches. But as the canine governance grew more entrenched, and policies leaned ever more toward public naps and chew zone expansion, murmurs began to stir in the rafters. Historians still argue whether there was a formal feline rebellion or just a persistent pattern of passive resistance. What is known is that a pamphlet began to circulate tiny, folded, and smelling faintly of mint and smugness. Its title, 9 Lives. No votes. The pamphlet raised concerns about unequal representation in council affairs, excessive barking in shared sleeping zones, and the recent policy of no leaps without leashes, which inadvertently restricted feline rooftop travel. It was unsigned, but paw-smeared with a distinct claw symbol. Barcadia's response surprisingly measured. A special council session was called, complete with warm cushions and anti-allergen protocols to hear the concerns of the feline population. The results were mixed. A delegation of cats arrived late, refused to sit, knocked over the water bowls, and left during the opening sniff round. Their interpreter, a stoic librarian named Malin, reported that the cats found the decor insulting, the biscuits irrelevant, and the scent of lavender emotionally condescending. Still, the council voted to establish the Whiskered Advisory Committee, a non-voting body intended to whisker alternative perspectives into ongoing policy. Unfortunately, few cats ever attended. Most claimed they preferred to influence outcomes through strategic aloofness. Other species joined the quiet unrest. Mice, traditionally ignored in civic design, began carving miniature protest slogans into table legs. Birds composed sarcastic songs about tail chasing as a metaphor for political futility. One crow became a local legend for repeatedly stealing ceremonial collar bells mid-session and hiding them in the council compost heap. Even some humans began frequenting the shadow burrow. Not many. Just those who questioned the fairness of pawmate interpretations or disliked how every public speech had to begin with a biscuit offering. A movement formed, loose-knit, respectful, but skeptical. They weren't anti-dog, exactly. They just missed being asked. They proposed new systems, shared sniff forums, rotating nap priorities, multi-species councils with squirrel mediators. Most of these ideas were received with polite head tilts, a few slow tail wags, and then were quietly ignored. Still, resistance never turned violent. That wasn't the Barcadian way. Instead, it showed up in smaller acts, a string of yarn tied across a walkway at snout height, collars mysteriously misbuttoned on voting day, anonymous letters delivered in claw-sealed envelopes, always written in impeccable script, always ending with deepest purrs. One particularly ambitious project was the Whisker Referendum, a citywide attempt to determine if non-canine residents should gain voting privileges. The council agreed to the vote. Ballots were prepared. Bickets were distributed for participation snacks. But on the day of the vote, not a single cat showed up. They claimed they'd already voted in their own way by deciding it wasn't worth voting on. It became one of the most talked-about political gestures in Barcadian history. Debates raged about the symbolism, the snub, the scent of it all. One opinion scroll was titled, "When Silence Purrs Louder Than Bark." Over time, the shadow burrow became less of a threat and more of a feature, a reminder that not everyone wanted the world to wag, that some citizens preferred stillness, solitude, and mystery over biscuits and barked legislation. You pass a faded mural now, painted beneath a half-collapsed loft. It shows a cat and a dog curled nose to tail, asleep under a shared patch of moonlight. The words beneath read, "Not all voices bark, but all deserve to dream." Today, many consider the shadow burrow a crucial part of Barcadia's cultural legacy, a space that complicated the narrative, added texture to its tail-wagging harmony, and quietly demanded that inclusion mean more than just biscuit quotas. You stand quietly at the archway, the echo of distant mews and chirps filling the silence like a wind you hadn't noticed until now. And you realize even the most peaceful cities need a little skepticism in the rafters. Section 10. Mystic Mutts and Sacred Whimpers. Unravel the role of divine prophecy and policy, led by oracles who snored through sermons. The light is softer now, as if the sun itself is easing into a nap. You follow the scent of something oddly floral lavender with a faint trace of wet dog and find yourself approaching one of Barcadia's more curious landmarks. It's a round structure, low to the ground and domed with woven branches and tufts of moss. A bell hangs from the entryway, shaped like a drooping ear. Above the lintel, faded script reads, "The Temple of the Sacred Whimper." This is where the mystic mutts lived. Not exactly clergy, not quite prophets. More like very sleepy therapists with a flair for dramatic sighing. Their job was to interpret dreams, observe tail twitches during REM cycles, and channel the city's spiritual questions through naps and oracular yawns. The sacred whimper was not a sound easily faked. It came, they believed, from deep within the soul, a tremble of breath during slumber that carried truth, longing, and sometimes the week's weather. Only the eldest, dreamiest dogs could produce it. To be admitted into the ranks of the mystic mutts, one had to pass the test of 3 sleeps and nap under moonlight, a nap amidst loud children, and a nap interrupted halfway by a delivery pigeon. If the applicant resumed snoring within 10 seconds of each disturbance, they were deemed spiritually porous and accepted. You step inside the temple. The floor is covered in rugs, so plush they feel like memory foam made of clouds. Bells chime gently as the breeze stirs the branches overhead. In the center is the whimpering stone, a flat slab where dogs would doze during festivals, waiting for a prophetic sound. Sometimes they'd whimper once, a simple, sorrowful note. That meant the crops would be late. Sometimes they'd whimper twice, a trembling, hopeful sigh. That meant good hunting, or at least excellent belly rubs ahead. 3 whimpers that meant change, uncomfortable, necessary, and usually involving fleas. Historians still argue whether these predictions were genuinely divine or just very clever napping. But what's clear is this Barcadia took them seriously. Entire council sessions were postponed if the mutts predicted bad vibes. Treat quotas were adjusted. Public walk schedules were shuffled to align with favorable astrological tail alignments. You pass a shelf of scrolls titled Dreams and Drool Vols Is Fis. Their covers are stained with thyme and paw oil, but each details visions received during official naps, glowing bones, rivers running uphill, squirrels speaking in riddles. One scroll contains the only surviving record of the 4-legged future, in which all of Barcadia reportedly ascended into the sky in a giant floating kennel powered by synchronized tail wagging. That one was mostly ignored, but politely archived. It wasn't just the dogs who visited the temple. Humans came too, especially those seeking answers or comfort. They would sit cross-legged at the edge of the rugs, waiting for a mutt to fall asleep beside them. If the dog turned its belly toward you, that was a sign of trust. If it rested its chin on your knee-divine favor, one famous mutt, a deeply wrinkled Sharpei named Thistle, once slept for 36 hours straight on the eve of a major treaty. When she finally stirred, she rolled over, released a single tiny sigh, and fell back asleep. The next day, the treaty passed unanimously, and the sausage harvest that season was the best on record. The temple also held the Ritual of the Tired Tails, a monthly event where overworked council members would be brought here for a supervised nap. They'd lie in a circle around the whimpering stone while soft wind chimes and lullabies composed entirely of snuffling noises played in the background. You can imagine it now, Labradors flopped on their sides, bulldogs wheezing gently, a single border collie twitching in her sleep as she dreamed of organizing her neighbors. There was even a prayer of sorts, not spoken aloud, but breathed softly as one settled into rest. May my dreams be biscuit-shaped. May my paws twitch true. May the squirrel I chase not vanish too soon. You smile. It's a silly verse, but in Barcadia, spirituality didn't mean grand cathedrals or fire and brimstone. It meant softness, stillness, the belief that sleep wasn't just for rest, but for revelation. And sometimes it meant whispers. There were whispers of other mystics, non-dogs, who had their own traditions. A parrot named Mela, who squawked in rhyme every third full moon. A raccoon who dreamt in puzzles and once correctly predicted a council election outcome by rearranging trash in the shape of a paw. They were never formal members of the temple, but the mystic mutts allowed them space, as long as they respected nap time. You sit now by the whimpering stone, your fingers brushing its smooth, time-worn edge. The moss here is warm. The air smells like ancient biscuits and dusted fur. You can almost hear the gentle huff of breath from a dreaming pup beside you, and you wonder maybe there's something to it. Maybe listening to what's murmured in sleep is just as important as what's shouted in council chambers. Maybe truths come better with a yawn. Outside, a breeze rustles the wind chimes again, and for the briefest moment, one of them sounds uncannily like a dog sighing in its sleep. You smile, lean back, and let your own thoughts drift into something softer, something sacred. Section 11, Fleas, Plagues, and Public Health Trace. How fleas nearly collapsed the city's canine democracy and what they did instead of vaccines. The air shifts again as you leave the soft quiet of the temple and step into a part of Barcadia that feels itchier. You're in the old health district now, once known as the Scratch Ward. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. For all its charm, Barcadia was not without its biological challenges, chief among them fleas. Unapologetic, tireless, democratically indifferent fleas. Fleas were the great equalizer. They did not care for rank or breed, council status, or the sheen of your collar. Every citizen, from Cleo herself to the lowliest stray, was susceptible, and so, out of necessity, Barcadia developed one of the most inventive, if occasionally absurd, public health systems in pre-modern history. You walk past what remains of the Flea Forum, a circular plaza once ringed by informational chew boards, water basins, and the Scratch Circle, a stone ring where citizens with particularly tenacious itches gathered to exchange remedies and scratch in rhythmic unison. It was both functional and strangely beautiful. One poet wrote, "Their legs moved like metronomes, keeping time with the thump of relief." In the early years, fleas were treated as a seasonal nuisance. Herbal washes made from rosemary and mint were common, and flea collars woven from lemongrass and blessed by the mystic mutts were issued at birth. But as the city grew denser and tail-to-tail contact became unavoidable during debates and festivals, outbreaks became more frequent. So Barcadia responded with public health infrastructure the way it did everything else with fur, flair, and faint silliness. The city founded the Office of Itch Affairs, housed in a 3-story brick building affectionately known as the Flea Hive. From here, trained sniff nurses patrolled the city, offering on-the-spot evaluations and recommending treatment paths, dust baths, cold river dips, or, in advanced cases, the dreaded cone. Yes, the cone of shame existed, but here it was renamed the halo of temporary stillness, and came in optional floral patterns. Dogs who wore it received public head pats and were exempt from official duties until cleared. One council member, a pug named Lolo, famously wore hers for 3 consecutive weeks and claimed it gave her the deepest clarity of political vision. More ambitious was the flea census, a city-wide campaign to count, document, and categorize every flea in Barcadia. Citizens were asked to report infestations by how many wriggles per nap they observed. The census was discontinued after a pack of young hounds turned it into a competitive sport, claiming prizes for most theatrical scratching and flea that looked most like a senator. Historians still argue whether Barcadia's flea problem was truly ever under control. Records show periodic itch emergencies, during which napping mats were replaced, voting cushions were rescented, and entire streets were closed for lavender fogging. Citizens received flea safety scrolls at their doors, often in the form of bedtime rhymes. Scratch not in haste, nor nibble the side. Let herbs do the work, stay dignified. But fleas weren't the only issue. There were bouts of tail rot, caused by over-vigorous wagging during election season. Cases of mid-nap bark disorder, where dogs shouted in their sleep and disrupted council votes. And one mysterious illness known only as the zonk, in which dogs slept for 3 days straight and awoke with no memory but a strong desire to eat pickled trout. The response to the zonk was, appropriately, more naps. Citizens were encouraged to sleep it off in soft-scented dormitories staffed by lullaby musicians. One popular performer, a harpist named Minnow, composed entire sets based on the rhythms of dog snoring. She claimed it activated healing vibrations through the fur. You walk now past the remains of a once glorious bathhouse, the Socatorium, where public defleeings took place. It featured spiral soaking pools, gentle shampoo stations, and treat dispensers built into the walls. Dogs would enter itchy and distraught. They'd leave damp, dazed, and slightly perfumed. A faded mural near the entrance depicts a pack of dogs lounging in clouds of steam, cucumbers over their eyes, while humans towel them dry and scribble health notes on scrolls. Still, despite their inventive efforts, Barcadians never fully conquered disease. Their medicine was more holistic than scientific. Remedies involved sniffs, stews, and sacred sighs. They believed in preventative rest, communal snuggling, and airing out public frustration via synchronized tail chasing. And yet somehow it worked, or at least, it soothed. One of the last surviving health decrees discovered reads, "All citizens, regardless of limb count or tail curl, shall be permitted rest without interruption, unless a squirrel emergency is declared." You stop at a quiet patch of grass now, overgrown and softly rustling. A stone stands in the middle, carved with a sleeping dog, nose tucked beneath paw. The inscription reads, "She itched, she scratched, she healed, she slept." You sit beside it, and you think, perhaps, that wellness in Barcadia was never about perfection. It was about care, about stopping long enough to notice the twitch of an ear, the heaviness of another's sigh, about knowing that a good scratch, a shared nap, and a biscuit afterward could sometimes do more than the sharpest remedy. And that's not such a silly kind of wisdom, really. Section 12. The Great Kennel Fire. A sleepy retelling of the night the capital barked itself into ruin and who sniffed out the cause. Evening draws nearer now. The light thins, curling like smoke across the rooftops and pooling in the cracks of the old flagstones. You're approaching the southern edge of the city, where stone meets scorched wood and the air smells faintly of ash. even after all these years. This is where the Great Kennel Fire began. It started with a single overturned lantern, or maybe a knocked-over stove, or, according to one oral history, a particularly dramatic disagreement over whether chew bones should be distributed according to age or size. Historians still argue about the source, but everyone agrees on one thing: it changed Barcadia forever. The fire swept through the central quarters, leaping from mat to market, from bakery to bathhouse, with frightening speed. The city's iconic chew-wood beams, scented, soft, and so very flammable, turned entire blocks into glowing tinder boxes within hours. You walk among the ruins now. Blackened walls, roofless towers, melted bells. Here and there, the faint outline of a paw print is still visible in soot, preserved mid-panic. A collapsed arch bears a carved motto: "We nap together." Or not at all. The kennel fire didn't just threaten structures. It struck at the heart of Barcadia's sleepy, communal rhythm. The fire moved faster than any tail could wag. It didn't pause for belly rubs. It didn't care for democratic procedure. And yet even in the chaos, Barcadians responded as only they could. You reach a plaza where the council mat once lay. It's charred now, but you can picture the scene: smoke in the air, dogs howling orders, humans rushing with buckets and wet towels. The mystic mutts organized triage naps. The Treat Guild opened their vaults to fuel fleeing families. One heroic retriever named Sedge dragged 7 biscuits and a blind spaniel to safety before collapsing with exhaustion. Emergency legislation was passed mid-disaster, quite literally on a damp napkin. It suspended biscuit taxes, rerouted all treat deliveries to displaced pups, and established Barcadia's first formal cuddle shelters. One of these shelters remains. Its scorched sign barely legible: fur first, debate later. And amid it all, the most surprising act of all, a cat sounded the alarm. A sleek black feline named Nil, normally regarded with suspicion by the tail-wagging elite, climbed to the top of the bell tower and yowled until the entire quarter was roused. Her howl, described by one witness as the sound of indignation wrapped in thunder, woke the council before the fire reached their chamber. Nil was later awarded the city's highest honor, the Golden Wag. She refused it. Typical. Barcadia lost much that night. Over half the council chambers were destroyed. Archives of early votes were singed beyond recovery. The biscuit economy shuddered under the strain of emergency redistribution. But more than structures, it was the routine that burned the predictability of naps, the reliability of slow days and long walks. Still, the city did what it always did. It rebuilt. And not just with bricks, with practices, with pauses, with patience. You pass a series of posts driven into the ground, each with a single bell attached. These were placed as part of the Sniff and Signal Project, a post-fire emergency alert system. Dogs could raise an alarm by pawing a post, ringing the bell, and sending a scented scroll to council via the smoke hounds, a relay team of particularly fast greyhounds trained to sprint between message stations with scented saddlebags. Not all the rebuilds were practical. One artist, a terrier named Mint, constructed an abstract monument to the fire using only salvaged chew toys and charred collar fragments. It was titled The Whimpering Flame. No one knew what it meant, but it made a pleasant squeaking sound in the breeze. And as always, the mystic mutts offered guidance. They declared a week of silent sniffing, no barks, no howls, just gentle acknowledgement of what was lost. Some citizens wore black ribbons on their tails. Others offered silent walks through ruined corridors, each step a prayer. One tradition that emerged after the fire was the ash nap, an annual citywide rest held on the fire's anniversary. Everyone, dog and human alike, stopped what they were doing at sunset and lay down wherever they were, parks, kitchens, doorways. For 10 minutes, the city held its breath and remembered. You imagine that silence, now thousands of chests rising and falling in unison, tails curled, ears drooped, paws twitching in dreams not of flames, but of fountains and shade. Near the edge of the scorched district, you find a plaque, still legible beneath its soot crust. To all who barked, who fled, who stayed, who fought fire with wagging hearts, who rebuilt not just homes, but hope. And beside it, someone has etched a more recent addition. May we never burn faster than we can nap. You sit there for a while. The wind picks up, gentle now, swirling ash and memories around your feet. It's strange how cities endure, not because of walls or fireproof stone, but because someone cared enough to rebuild a biscuit oven, because someone whispered a bedtime story over soot, because a cat climbed a tower, and because even in disaster, someone remembered to bring the squeaky toy. Section 13. What the neighbors thought wander through ancient letters, outsider accounts, and sarcastic maps drawn by confused traders. You leave the scorched stones behind now, following a wide, lazily winding path toward a hilltop overlooking what was once the outer edge of Barcadia. The wind picks up a little as you climb, tugging at the overgrown grass and rustling the leaves like the whisper of forgotten conversations. Up here, the world looks different. You can see the ruins below the curved council plaza, the crooked bell tower, the clustered rooftops of the fashion quarter, and beyond that, green hills roll out like a sleepy quilt. This was where the outsiders came. Barcadia was never truly isolated, for all its peculiar customs. It sat at the intersection of several trade routes, some ancient, some invented by enthusiastic sheepdogs who wandered too far and returned with surprising cheeses. You're standing in what was once the Landing Pause district, a collection of inns, market stalls, and visitors' halls for travelers from beyond Barcadia's wagging borders. It was a place of cautious curiosity, where customs clashed, tails wagged nervously, and everyone tried to pretend they understood the local biscuit economy. Most foreign visitors were confused. Some were enchanted. A few were horrified. One diplomat from a northern kingdom wrote, "Their streets are clean. Their leaders nap. Their trials involve barking, and yet it works." Outsiders were often granted honorary biscuits upon arrival, wrapped in cloth and paired with a scroll explaining city etiquette. Things like, "Do not interrupt during a tail chase. Offer your hand palm up to greet a citizen. Refuse a biscuit only if you are physically incapable of eating. Otherwise, it is considered an insult to civic generosity." The most famous foreign account comes from a trader named Ulwin of the Salt Road, who described his first Barcadian council session in vivid detail. A pug rose to speak. He did not bark. He simply sneezed. The room fell into contemplative silence. I had never seen such discipline. Ulwin stayed for 3 months and eventually wrote a short handbook titled The Sleepy Republic, a traveler's guide to tail-based governance. It became unexpectedly popular in his homeland, inspiring a brief but passionate fad of collar-wearing senators. It did not last, of course. Not all visitors were amused. Some scoffed at the Council of Collars. Others challenged the system openly. There's a record of one particularly vocal goat who tried to interrupt a vote with an impromptu bleeding filibuster. He was escorted out not by guards, but by a delegation of corgis who gently herded him out of the chamber in perfect silence. And yet, many stayed. Merchants from distant deserts brought fine silks only to see them repurposed into ceremonial treat wraps. A musician from the East taught his stringed instrument to a local hound named Roo, who could produce a full octave of soulful howls in harmony with the chords. One family of spice traders set up a permanent shop selling cinnamon and liver-scented candles and stayed until the fire. You find the remnants of one such shop now. The sign reads, "Snout and Spice." Aromatics for every mood. Inside, only fragments remain: dried herbs, an overturned bowl, a torn cushion with embroidered text. "Peace is a well-scented nap." But perhaps the most poignant visitor perspective comes from a letter found decades later in a hollow stone bench overlooking the southern cliffs. It reads, "I came expecting madness. I found clarity. They do not need guards because no one runs. They do not need speeches because a tale speaks louder. I left them a map to our cities, but I did not take theirs." No name, just a drawing of a biscuit beside a compass. Interestingly, Barcadians were notoriously bad at maps. They found them unnecessary. Most directions were given via landmarks like "turn left at the statue with the best moss," or "go 3 barks past the bakery and stop when you smell salmon." Foreigners found this maddening. Locals found it charming. Historians still argue whether Barcadia ever intended to export its ideas. Some say the council once debated founding a satellite nap state in the hills, but no one could agree on a name. Others suggest that Barcadia's influence spread subtly through the travelers who left carrying stories and strange biscuits with surprisingly long shelf lives. And yet, there are no records of any city adopting Barcadia's full model. Bits and pieces. Perhaps a nap-friendly office here, a communal biscuit fund there, but nothing quite matched the slow, shared rhythm of this place. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Barcadia worked only because it didn't try to convince anyone else to do the same. It just wagged quietly, scratched when needed, and let visitors find their own way in or out. You sit on the edge of the hill now, overlooking the fading light as it drapes the city in gold. A breeze carries the scent of sage and something else: baked bread, faded lavender memory. Somewhere below, a weather-worn flag still flaps from a broken pole. Not a symbol of conquest or pride. Just a paw print, smudged, honest, and perhaps the most welcoming thing of all. Section 14. The Last Loyal Leash. Hear how the city faded, why it never returned, and who kept walking their dogs just in case. You rise from the hilltop, letting the last threads of sunlight stretch behind you like sleepy limbs reaching for one more minute in bed. Your feet carry you northward now, toward the oldest part of Barcadia, where the cobbles are nearly erased by grass, and the wind hums like a lullaby through the collapsed beams of what was once the original council kennel. This is where the first leash was buried. It's a quiet place now. No signs, no chewing posts. Just a broad circle of earth surrounded by soft, sun-warmed stones and a few crooked stakes where long-dead banners once fluttered. But once, this was where the council gathered in the open air, paws pressed to soil, tails thumping in deliberation. And it's here that the story ends not with a bark, but with a whisper. The fall of Barcadia didn't happen all at once. There was no final vote. No dramatic collapse, no great betrayal involving stolen biscuits and a suspiciously persuasive parrot, though some fringe theories insist otherwise. Instead, it simply slowed down. Some say it began when the biscuit vaults ran dry. Others point to a particularly soggy spring when the gutters overflowed and several key council nap mats were lost to mildew. But most agree it wasn't disaster. It was drift. New generations rose, more distracted, less nap-oriented. Some started questioning the council structure. Others preferred private governance, small backyard meetings held around fire pits, with individualized treats and tailored tail wag rituals. A few even abandoned collars altogether, claiming their voices were being misrepresented by pawmates with snack biases. The Council of Collars tried to adapt. They introduced bark by mail, established remote napping zones. One desperate year, they allowed cats to co-chair certain committees on a trial basis, with the understanding that hissing would be kept to a minimum. But it wasn't enough. The tail thumping got quieter. The festivals lost their bark-offs. One year, no one showed up for the treat census. Another year, the Great Zoomy Run only drew 2 participants, a senior pug and a distracted squirrel. You arrive at a low stone wall now, crumbling but not forgotten. A single plaque is embedded in it, weathered but legible. Here was placed the last loyal leash, in honor of Cleo, who stayed until the very end and voted only when necessary. The leash itself is gone, presumably taken by a sentimental scavenger or quietly reclaimed by time, but the groove it left in the stone remains. You run your fingers along it. It's shallow, gentle, like a final wag in fading light. There are a few surviving stories of the last council session. It's said that only 5 dogs attended, 2 asleep, 1 deaf, and 1 there by accident. The 5th, a wiry mutt named Bram, barked once, sighed twice, and lay down in the center of the circle. The others joined him, and that was that. Barcadia was never conquered. It was never abandoned. It was just walked away from. As the years passed, the vines returned. The biscuit trees, yes, they had those flavorless, dry, but symbolically important stopped bearing. The mural paint flaked, and the city became a place of dreams, half remembered, half believed. Travelers still came from time to time, some looking for the treat vault, others searching for the sacred whimper. A few just followed the wind, chasing a scent that smelled like lavender and something just a little toasted. And some say the dogs are still here. You sit on the edge of the old council circle now. The grass is soft, the wind is warm, and if you close your eyes just for a second, you can hear it. The slow creak of a collar bell in the breeze. The distant jingle of tags as a ghostly pack trots past, invisible but certain. A bark, maybe, or just the echo of one, faint, familiar. Barcadia may be gone, but it left behind a rhythm, a softness, a reminder that democracy doesn't always have to shout. Sometimes it can nap. Section 15. The Echo of Empty Bowls. Drift through the overgrown ruins. Now silent, but for soft wind and the occasional phantom tail wag. Twilight has arrived like a hush falling over a full room. The edges of Barcadia blur into shadow now, the bones of the city resting beneath velvety dusk. Your steps grow slower, not because the path is difficult, but because some part of you doesn't want to leave just yet. You've reached the outskirts, the liminal edge where the forest begins to reclaim the land, and only fragments of what once was remain. A crooked sign leans beside a path worn smooth by time and pause. It reads, "The Echo of Empty Bowls." This was the final district, not by design, but by evolution. After Barcadia had begun to quiet, after the council chambers lay still and the treat census faded into myth, dogs and humans alike began drifting outward toward the quieter places. They didn't all leave. Some stayed behind, but differently. Without votes, without meetings, just with memories. The Echo District wasn't residential. It wasn't political. It was reflective, a place for stories, for soft goodbyes, and for bowls. Every home here had one on the doorstep, a bowl, some empty, some filled with river stones, others tucked with note scraps of parchment rolled tight and scented faintly with chicken broth and ink. Most were offerings. Some were memorials. All were personal. You kneel beside one now, a small, cracked ceramic dish with a paw print pressed into its base. Inside, a dried biscuit rests, crumbly, preserved more by affection than any preservative. The note beside it says, "For Kiva, who never learned to sit, but always came home anyway." There are hundreds like it, some with candles, some with collars, some with tufts of fur wrapped in ribbon, and not just for dogs, either. A few contain feathers. One holds a catnip mouse, another a spoon. This was how Barcadia chose to be remembered, not through statues, not through conquest, but through quiet tokens left in bowls, little circles of care and presence. There were rituals, too. Each spring, those who remained, sometimes no more than a dozen, gathered in the echo to clean the bowls, fluff the nearby moss, and share stories. No barking, no speeches, just a walk through memory. You pass a cluster of bowls with matching tags, snouts and family, 3 generations of biscuit bakers. The final bowl is newer. Its note simple, still baking, just in dreams. Historians still argue whether the Echo District was official. It wasn't on any maps. It had no gate, no sign-in rolls, but its presence, gently maintained, never advertised, spoke louder than any policy ever passed in council. As time went on, some travelers mistook it for a cemetery, others thought it a shrine. But for Barcadians, it was neither. It was a conversation. One side whispered, the other listened, and the bowls, they weren't symbols of loss. They were invitations. To remember, to imagine, to hope. You find a bench tucked between 2 hedges, almost hidden. It's worn, but solid. A cushion still rests on one end, shaped vaguely like a curled dog. You sit. The wind here carries stories. You can almost hear them. A dog barking at falling leaves. A child laughing as they're dragged across the plaza by an overexcited mutt with poor leash manners. A biscuit crumbling in the council chamber and being declared a sacred omen. The sound of tails wagging, a paw resting on a stone. Silence, but not the empty kind, the full kind. As the last light slips behind the hills, the bowls around you catch it, just for a moment. They gleam, as if lit from within by something warm, something remembered. You close your eyes. You breathe, you listen, and somewhere very faint, almost lost to the wind, you hear it. The soft, familiar clink of a collar tag tapping gently against an empty bowl. So now, here you are still, quiet, and nestled in the softest shadows of Barcadia. The city is hushed, the echoes faded, and even the wind has curled itself into a slow, contented sigh. You feel your limbs grow heavy, like worn rugs settling into the contours of an old wooden floor. Your thoughts stretch out, long and lazy, drifting like sleeping paws twitching in some gentle dream. You remember the bells, the bark-offs, the biscuits, the ridiculous collars, the serious naps. You remember the dogs who led with yawns, who voted with paws, who taught a whole city that governance could be sleepy, silly, and sincere. Maybe tonight your own dreams will wander these mossy streets. Maybe you'll find yourself walking once more down the cracked stone paths, past the scent-laden scrolls and the flea forum, past the echoing bowls and the biscuit-stamped ballots. Maybe you'll hear the faint jingle of a collar, the rhythmic thump of a tail. Maybe, just maybe, you'll turn a corner and see a round, noble face looking up at you with tired eyes and a wag of recognition. And maybe she'll vote for rest, for you, for this moment. So let your shoulders soften, let your breath settle low in your belly. Let the weight of the day slip away, like paw prints washed clean in a sleepy spring rain. You don't need to remember every word, just carry the feeling, because Barcadia may be gone, but the nap is eternal. Good night. End of.